Hello, and thank you for downloading another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is Brian Leitner, and I'll be the host of this podcast. We have a very special podcast for you today because we're talking about the Secure Act, which is a new piece of legislation that has recently come out. The Secure Act stands for Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement. And there's a lot of reasons that this legislation has been passed. If we think about retirement and those that are living longer, and the fact that the government is looking for ways to raise revenue. And in fact, in this act alone, the government expects to raise between 15 and 16 billion in tax revenue over the next 10 years. And so whenever a new piece of legislation comes out, everyone wants to know how they're going to be impacted, whether this is good news for you or bad news for you. So today's guest is Scott Sturgeon from the practice management team at Mariner Wealth Advisors to help us walk through who the winners are, who the losers are, and things that we can think about to enhance our overall financial plan as it relates to some of these changes. So Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me. Honored and privileged to be here.
We're thankful you're here. You're somewhat new to the podcast, although you've been working behind the scenes for some time, so we appreciate you showing your face.
Thank you. Moderately terrifying to be on this side of the mic, but I'm going to embrace it and we'll get through it.
You're doing great so far.
Thank you.
Hey, just by background, would you spend maybe 60 seconds on your background and expertise and kind of what you do for Mariner?
Sure. So again, Scott Sturgeon. I'm by training an attorney. I have a law degree and a master's in business and finance, and also recently acquired my CFP designation, that's Certified Financial Planner. I was an advisor for a couple of years and then transitioned over here to Mariner and haven't really looked back ever since. It's been great.
So Scott, it's great to have you. And as we walk through this, maybe let's start with the winners, right? I mean, what are some of the wins as it relates to this act and who's really going to benefit?
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I think you hit the nail on the head kind of when you were in your intro going over kind of the reasons why this act came about. Real winners and losers. I think it really depends on who the individual is and kind of what their individual financial picture looks like. Overall, there's kind of a confluence of two factors here that are really contributing to why the act came about. Number one being, you mentioned people are living a lot longer. And number two, a big one that, is maybe news to no one, that there's kind of this pending, crisis is the word I hear mentioned a lot. But quite simply, there's a big disproportionate population within the United States that doesn't have enough retirement savings. So, the goal, I think, of this act is to really address some of those shortcomings. But as you mentioned, there for sure are winners and losers within that. Just to start off, there's a change to, IRAs in general. We had the age for required minimum distributions that are forced to come out of an IRA, or I guess heavily incentivized to come out of an IRA at age 70 and a half, changed to 72. So seemingly a small change, 18 months, you would not think is that big of a deal. I kind of thought of this as like you're getting socks for Christmas. It's very practical, but maybe it's not the biggest change, but it is helpful for individuals to have that added time to put funds into a tax-deferred account to allow that to grow over time. Hopefully some benefit to be derived there.
So the old age was 70 and a half, and
Correct.
now it is 72. And this is really for those that are not currently taking RMDs. Again, they're grandfathered under that.
Right.
This is for those in 2020 that are turning 72.
Right. If you turned 70 and a half on December 31st, 2019, awesome work. You were literally one of the last individuals who can...
Congratulations.
Yeah. You unfortunately have to start RMD sooner. If you turned 70 and a half on January 1st, 2020, even better congratulations, because you get to wait for basically 2 years almost before you basically have to take that money out of your IRA.
So great opportunity to continue to let things compound. And again, it may not be for 5 years, but I mean, for the period of time that it is, I think every little bit is helpful.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think, and even just from, not to go back to my sock analogy again, but, it's just very practical, I think. 70 and a half is kind of confusing, candidly. There's a lot of rules that go into when RMDs are forced to come out of an IRA. And so I think clients in general, we found, regardless of where you are, it's just confusing. And 72 is a much more kind of line in the sand number, makes it much easier to determine when those funds need to come out. I think it simplifies a lot of things and really is just kind of an overall positive.
One of the other positives was the ability to contribute to a IRA on an ongoing basis, even after 70 and a half. Is that right?
Right. So that was a decent change. Prior to the Secure Act, once you turned 70 and a half and you started taking those RMDs, those required minimum distributions, you could no longer contribute to your IRA. That changes with the Secure Act. basically with the new age of 72, you can even keep contributing to that IRA. As long as you're working, you can keep contributing to that account. And, benefit there being basically you're able to keep growing those dollars over time. We see people working longer. I feel like, one stat I pulled was the average life expectancy currently in the US is 79 years of age. They're expecting that to be about 84 by 2050. Obviously, women tend to live a little longer,
sure,
men a little shorter. But I think, being reflective of that, the increased age, falls right into the lap of individuals who are probably going to be working longer, and it's not uncommon for them to be working past 70, I think, as moving forward.
It's a great point. I mean, we live in a gig economy now, right, to some degree. So you have people that are either maybe they're not, the whole word retirement is changing, as we all know, and it's graduating and they're doing something a little bit different. So maybe they're not working the same hours they did or even in the same career, but maybe they're doing some consulting on the side. Maybe they're driving for Uber. I mean, it could be all these different things just to keep their mind active, right, and just to have something to do. So to be able to contribute there, continue to grow that nest egg, again, that's a great benefit.
Sure. I call it a win. That's a win.
Without a doubt. A couple other wins that the Act provides for. So do you want to talk about the penalty-free distributions for children?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting one. So one of the changes that came about with the Secure Act is that individuals can now withdraw up to $5,000 penalty-free from an IRA or a 401k to pay for childbirth costs, which is kind of weird. It doesn't seem to make sense. But at the time, when I first read it, I was like, well, there are better accounts to do that from. There's HSAs, health savings accounts, can be withdrawn for medical expenses almost at any time, but there's limitations to those and who can actually have them. Maybe note for Congress, if we want to redraft this a little bit, maybe we make HSAs a little more expanded. Just my suggestion.
Pass that along.
Yeah, thank you. Call your congressman. But really the crux of this, I think, is that when we look overall within, the United States, there's kind of this creeping medical debt issue. Medical costs are obviously very expensive. So there's certainly a subset of the population where having the ability to pull funds out of that retirement account might be a better option than, going into debt, potentially having high interest costs associated with that. I mean, I would say overall, it's not a great option, but it is an option to have.
It's going to disrupt, right, the long-term savings plan that you have for retirement. But at the same time, if people don't have access to other funds, this is a great opportunity. So exactly, to your point, hopefully people don't abuse it.
Right.
But there's also, it's the American dream, right? I want to have 2.2 kids. I want to have a house. I want to have, so anyway, just at least it provides for greater flexibility for most people.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge one. I think overall there's a stat, again, I pulled that 60% of investors between the ages of 18 and 34 have withdrawn some amount from their 401k to cover costs. So, clearly there's an issue there. I guess the question is there a way to make it such that, there are better options just to satisfy needs?
You bet.
Medical debt is one of the biggest, debts just in general that consumers carry. So having that option there is a decent one, I think.
And speaking of medical debt, or debt for that matter, is a great transition to the next win, right? And the next win being the ability to take distributions from 529s to pay off student debt. Can you talk to that for a minute?
Yeah, this was an interesting one. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017, we saw kind of an expansion of what 529 plans can do. And so just a quick brief on 529s. It's essentially a tax-deferred investment savings account that individuals can put money into. It allows them to save for college for their kids. They can then pull that money out. Let's say I just had my kid or my kid's 2 or 3 or what have you. I put that money into the account. It grows over 10, 15, however many years till they get to college or what have you. I pull the money out to then pay for their college expenses. That's great. The TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, expanded that a little bit, which is kind of nice. It allowed for secondary education costs to be covered. So thinking like high school, even private school tuition, things like that. This I think is kind of an expansion on that even further, basically saying that individuals can withdraw up to $10,000 or use $10,000 from their 529 plan to pay for student loan debt. The interesting thing about this is there really isn't a federal, tax benefit to doing this, but essentially individuals can put that money into a 529 plan and get a state tax deduction for it. So if you look at kind of I think from my perspective, kind of the real winners of this, and maybe it's a few $100s in state tax deductions they can get out of it, but Real winners are going to be younger individuals who are maybe relatively fresh out of school. Maybe they're a physician or a dentist or an attorney or something. They make too much money to deduct student loan interest expenses, but they really don't have any other options. So this is kind of a nice little potential tax break at the state level for them to have.
Should you get in that jam, and should you have that as a situation, which frankly is becoming a crisis in this country and has for some time, right?
Oh, so. Yeah, without question. It's always interesting to kind of look at, there's always both ends of the spectrum of this. We know that student loan debt is this huge burden just in general on a lot of people in this country. But at the same time, there's individuals who can also just kind of, have a small tax break or benefit from taking advantage of that.
You bet.
That's a win.
So Scott, great point as it relates to the deductibility or the tax-free nature of the 529. A lot of that is going to be state specific and individual specific, but those are great points. So Scott, that's great. Any other wins as it relates to the Secure Act for folks?
Yeah, sure. Just a really quick offhand one. There were changes allowed from the Secure Act that basically expanded the opportunity for part-time workers to become enrolled in employer retirement plans. They were not necessarily restrictive, but basically it enhanced the ability for, maybe you're working part-time at, a restaurant or even if you're retired and working part-time somewhere, dependent on employer, basically the ability to enroll in those plans has been expanded. So maybe where you didn't have access to a 401k before, you do now.
Which is terrific.
Oh yeah. Any opportunity to take advantage of, the tax deferral and the benefits that come with that, I think are a huge one.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode. So Scott, we talked about a lot of wins and good things from the Secure Act, but the reality is there is some bad. There's something referred to as the death of the stretch IRA, which is going to apply to a lot of our listeners, a lot of clients, a lot of folks out there, and they really do need to take action because this is going to impact their overall plan. So if you think about it, prior to this act, the way it used to work was that beneficiaries were required to take minimum distributions out of an inherited IRA in a given way. So let me walk you through maybe a simple example. There's $1 million IRA that's owned by dad, and dad passes. And those assets, the primary beneficiary is mom. So those assets then go to mom, and mom can roll it into her own IRA, treat it as if it's her own. She's going to live maybe another 5 or 10 years. And then afterwards, it's going to go to her primary beneficiary. Let's just say they had one child and it goes to their son. And so maybe it's $1 million IRA. Their son is 40-something years old. His life expectancy is, say, 40 years. Well, from a required minimum distribution, he's going to take that, 1/40th of that as a distribution on an annual basis. And that'll be ordinary income to him, but he gets to stretch it out over his lifetime. So it's still growing tax deferred. And that's the way it used to work.
Right.
Now there's a challenge. With the Secure Act, the tax man wants to get their hands on this money a whole lot sooner. So now in that same example, again, dad passes with $1 million. It goes to mom. Mom gives it to Junior. Well, Junior can no longer stretch that out over his lifetime. In fact, there's a 10-year period of time that he needs to then drain that account. And so on $1 million, just assuming no growth, let's just say that's $100,000 a year. Well, if Junior, is in his 40s and potentially they're successful, they have earned income, another $100,000 of ordinary income could kick them into a higher income tax bracket from a federal perspective, state, local. So there are a lot of different things to consider here. And again, they have a 10-year period to do so. So what used to be an incredible wealth transfer vehicle, this stretch IRA provision or this strategy, it no longer exists. And so the government's going to get their hands on the tax revenue a whole lot sooner. it really inhibits the ability to use this IRA, the stretch IRA provision as we once could as a wealth transfer vehicle. So it's a challenge at this point. So I and others have referred to this Secure Act and what they've done with the stretch IRA as death of the stretch or killing the stretch. I would say it's not necessarily dead. I mean, there are exceptions to the rule. So we'll say that it's wounded, but there are exceptions. For example, surviving spouses. They can treat the inherited IRA as if it is their own. They can roll it to their own IRA. Another exception is children that are minors. So you obviously wouldn't go to a 6-year-old and say your 10 years clock starts today. Effectively, they have 10 years after they reach age majority, which is either 18 or 21, depending upon the state. Chronically ill individuals or disabled individuals, they're exempt from this as well. And finally, individuals that are no more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. So that could be, maybe it's a sibling of the IRA owner or something of that nature. Those are the exceptions. This is where the stretch IRA is still very much alive.
Really, it seemed like to me, it's basically just the federal government essentially saying, okay, we see what you're doing with IRAs. We created these things in the 70s so you would save and then live off it in retirement. And now we're going to basically take away that estate planning, aspect of it, and basically get that tax revenue that we let you have essentially for however many years.
Exactly. And I think one of the issues is that, as advisors, good planning, we would say, if you needed to have a trust as the beneficiary of your IRA, you can set this up in a way to meet certain rules and criteria that you can make this a conduit IRA, which would enable you to have a trust as the beneficiary or the ultimate beneficiary of the IRA. The challenge is when these were written, for most documents anyway, and everyone's going to have their own specific situation, is that the trust document essentially says that the RMD, or the required minimum distribution, is going to be taken out on an annual basis, and that would satisfy the rules to become this conduit IRA. The challenge, of course, is now when the trustee is making these distributions and reads, literally the words RMDs must be made, there are no RMDs anymore. It's just a 10-year period of time. So what ends up happening is there is no distribution that's made, but they know the account has to be drained within 10 years. So the trustee ultimately says in year 10, I have to take all this money out. So within that situation, they take out $1 million and pay a huge tax hit all in 1 year. So for those individuals that have leveraged a strategy like that, they absolutely need to speak to their advisor, work with a qualified estate planning attorney to make sure that they can adjust the language as such that they can truly take advantage of this and try and understand if they even want that trust as a beneficiary anymore. I mean, most of the time, people set this up because they want control and want the benefit of the tax aspect of it. Well, now the tax aspect, a lot of that's been mitigated.
Right.
It still provides control, but there are issues that people need to consider at this point.
Yeah, I think it's trust documents in general. If an IRA is part of the equation of someone's estate, generally they're drafted relatively specifically to address that. I honestly kind of think like there's probably not something that comes along in estate planning where there's flashing lights, red flags, like, hey, you actually need to address this today.
That's the challenge.
This is one of those. It seems like there's a lot of people who could potentially get kind of caught up in this, not even really knowing what the ramifications were.
We talk about planning and it's an evolution, right? And things change. The market changes, laws change. I like to say, I think all these tax laws are written in pencil because at some point they are going to change, but we all have to be mindful of it because, this is a great example of how you thought you might have this opportunity to transfer wealth in a vehicle such as this. And the reality is an act comes along like this and completely changes that. And the truth of the matter is many people don't know much about this act at all.
No, I think within the, kind of the wealth planning or retirement planning, estate planning communities, this was for sure the elephant in the room that people were talking about for months and months and months. But I think you look just within, popular society or what have you, it's just not known or not understood or a combination of both. Which is unfortunate. It's people, you work hard to put things together and have things planned out. And it's like one small legislative change can have a massive detrimental impact.
I was talking to somebody this week that said, I was asking them about their estate plan and if things are up to date. And they said everything's up to date because they met with their attorney, about 11 months ago or about a year ago and everything. And I start talking about this act. They said, that's ridiculous. I just put this in place. And, the reality is I know you did. And I didn't I didn't create the act, but let me
Maybe
tell you
like a 90-day warranty on your estate plan or something. I don't know. Legislative, changes or things that come up. And one thing I wanted to touch on, it's obviously not great. The act, this portion of it is not not cool, I would say. There's some interesting things though, and there's some strategies that we've kind of crafted, and I think the industry is kind of coming around to that are going to be helpful. Do you want to touch on a couple of those or?
I'm happy to. One, of course, is the ability to maybe look at your IRA a little bit differently and think through what I refer to as Roth conversion, or converting those assets, those IRAs, to Roth IRAs, which the Roth IRA, there's a lot of misinformation that's out there, but with the Roth IRA, anybody can convert to a Roth IRA. Maybe not everybody can contribute to a Roth IRA because maybe their adjusted gross income is too high, but you can convert. You don't have to do it all in 1 year. There are different things that you want to think about. What's my tax rate this year? What's my tax rate over the next few years? Maybe I'm going to retire, and before I start taking distributions out, I'm going to go through this phase where I have lower income, and maybe I think about converting over a period of years at that point. Because again, it's going to be ordinary income to them. And so once they go through that process, though, whatever those assets were, make it up. If it's $1 million, depending upon their tax bracket, let's say that they end up with $700,000, that $700,000 is income tax free to beneficiaries. There's no RMDs on that as it relates to while that person is living. Their children will have to take, or whoever inherits that IRA, that non-spouse beneficiary will take RMDs, but there won't be tax associated with that, with those distributions. So we love the Roth IRA. Everybody's situation is a little bit different, but those are things to think about if there are listeners that are out there that are currently working and they're thinking about, they're contribute to a 401k, should they be contributing to a Roth 401k, a traditional 401k? These are great conversations to be having now with your advisor, especially in light of the Secure Act.
Without question. Very much the Roth conversion is a huge tool in the toolkit, basically, that I think often goes unlooked. It's very much kind of a short-term pain, long-term gain type of a thing, but very helpful nonetheless. One thing I wanted to make sure we talked on too was kind of strategies around maybe using charity as part of your estate plan. Charities are essentially able to take taxable dollars and there's really no ramification to them. So, having an IRA left to a charity or some sort of charitable vehicle can be a really good option.
One of the great things about leaving retirement assets to charities is that they get the full deduction, the fair market value. So if you give $1 million in an IRA, you leave that to charity, there's a deduction for $1 million, even though reality is your basis in that may be $200,000. So they're great assets to leave to charity. You can split those so you don't have to give the entire $1 million, but that is absolutely something to think about. The charity then sells that, and because it's a 501(c), they don't have to pay tax on that. And so really everybody wins, of course, except for the government from that perspective. Another thing to think about is, and this is pretty technical, so you really, again, want to make sure you're working with a competent advisor as well as a tax advisor, but it's on the beneficiaries themselves. So I'll walk you through this. And let's just say you have mom and dad. And in our example prior, we would say it's $1 million IRA. Well, the million, let's make it even simpler. Let's say it's a $2 million IRA. Dad passes, and generally he might leave the $2 million to his wife. And then what will happen is ultimately, again, assuming no growth, that $2 million will go to Junior. Junior will take $200,000 out over the next 10 years. Another way to think about that, though, again, the dynamics have to be right, but simply from a tax perspective, there's a lot more that goes into planning than just taxes, but here's an idea or thought process. If mom doesn't need the $2 million outright, maybe dad leaves mom $1 million and dad splits the IRA. He gives the other $1 million. He makes Junior the primary beneficiary on the account, again, on half of those assets. So when dad dies, $1 million goes to mom, and she's going to live for, say, another 10 years. The other $1 million goes to Junior, and Junior begins to take $100,000 out for 10 years. Let's say mom lives another 10 years. Well, then he's going to take, again, dad's distribution out for the first 10 years at $100,000. And then the following 10 years, he's going to take $100,000 out, which was what was given to mom for 10 years. So he's effectively stretched out these distributions for 20 years, as opposed to $200,000, which would crush him from a tax perspective over a 10-year period of time. So every situation's a little bit different.
Right.
But that might be an interesting way to work that out. Again, dynamics are important, goals are important.
Oh, for sure.
different things to be thinking about from that perspective. And, there's a host of other strategies that we can talk about, but if we can, encourage folks to speak to their wealth advisor and their tax advisor about these strategies, what might be right for them, because like we said earlier, everyone's situation is a little bit different.
Oh, for sure. We were talking even before we came in briefly, and essentially came to the conclusion that we're in this stuff all day long, every day. There's still elements of it that make my head spin. And so for the average Joe or Jane walking on the street, it's kind of like very easy to step in quicksand relatively quickly. So I think seeking out a professional, kind of having an advisor on your side is something that's huge without a doubt.
Without a doubt. It's overwhelming, and we understand that. So Scott, I know we talked about a handful of different strategies, a lot of the changes. What are a couple of the quick takeaways for our listeners?
Very simply, and just a few general questions or suggestions I have to pose to an advisor or someone maybe you're working with is, number one, how are these changes going to affect my individual financial plan? Everyone's is slightly different. There's no cookie cutter type approach. So that's a huge one. Number two, how are these going to affect my estate plan? They're kind of intertwined, but that's a huge one. This is potentially very far reaching, implications from this. Number three, is the Roth IRA conversion appropriate for me? And then just in general, what are some just general tax strategies I should be looking at from the Secure Act and kind of the fallout from it that I need to be mindful of or making, changes to my plan?
So Scott, that's terrific. I think folks are going to get a lot out of this. And I think this is the first step, right? Getting educated, understanding where they are, and then thinking through what it is that they need to do.
Sure.
So Scott, really appreciate you being here. Before we let you go, we like to ask all of our guests, what is the worst financial decision you've ever made? And being that you have a master's degree, a law degree, a CFP, I'm sure it doesn't happen often, but
you would be surprised. Candidly, I generally like to think I don't make that many, but I'll even go two. Number one is I think I have this constant anxiety of the mistakes I'm making that I don't know I'm making. Number two, I'll say of finite, financial mistakes. 401k loans are sometimes seemingly a good idea at the time.
Well, you need the money.
But it is a pain paying that off. And that's one thing I would maybe, for those just listening or considering it, that's one thing to certainly kind of think about.
Without a doubt. A lot of pitfalls with that strategy.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate you sharing. Appreciate being so vulnerable. More than anything, appreciate the advice. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Brian.
And to our listeners, thank you very much for listening. Again, if you guys have questions, suggestions, any type of feedback, please feel free to go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. Thanks again.
Mariner Wealth Advisors, or MWA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money.